If you really, if you stop and look around, we are currently living in what might just be the most comfortable, like, frictionless era in human history.
Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt.
Right. I mean, we have algorithms that do our deep thinking for us. We've got on-demand services that do literally all our walking and lifting. And this massive industry of synthetic pills that just promise to easily fix whatever breaks down inside us.
Yeah, it's kind of the ultimate pursuit of convenience. Like a perfectly smooth existence where discomfort is treated like a bug in the system. Or at least, I mean, that's the modern ideal we're all constantly being sold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what if all that friction, the struggle, the heavy lifting, the deep sadness, the sheer physical effort we are desperately trying to engineer out of our lives, what if that friction is actually the exact thing keeping our biology intact?
And that paradox is really at the center of modern aging. In our quest to just completely eliminate physical and emotional discomfort, we are inadvertently starving our bodies and brains of the specific signals they actually need to survive.
Wow.
Yeah, we might actually be accelerating our own biological decline simply by being, well, too comfortable.
Which is wild to think about. But anyway, welcome to today's deep dive. We are pulling from this incredibly comprehensive source text today. It's titled The Biology of Longevity, Systems for Human Flourishing. And it's just this massive compilation of cutting-edge, evidence-based strategies from top clinicians and researchers.
It really is, and it completely reframes how we look at aging. Rather than chasing, superficial quick fixes or symptom management, this document looks deeply at the underlying systems of the human body and how they interact with our modern environment.
Right. And to you listening, our mission today is not to just rattle off generic health advice. I mean, you already know to eat your vegetables and get 8 hours of sleep.
Hopefully.
Right. We want to uncover the specific, sometimes incredibly surprising systems that dictate how well and how long you live. So we were extracting the absolute best aha moments from this research to help you build your own blueprint for human flourishing, completely skipping the information overload.
But I should probably note right up front that our deep dive today is purely an exploration of the fascinating ideas presented in the source material. We are analyzing the research, but this is not an endorsement of specific medical treatments, and it certainly isn't a substitute for professional medical advice.
Oh, definitely. Always check with your doctor. Okay, let's start at the absolute top, the command center, the brain.
Right.
The text opens with this mind-blowing look at how extreme stress physically alters our neural hardware. It talks about trauma not just as, like, a psychological memory, but as a structural, physical mutation in the brain.
And this distinction changes literally everything about how we view chronic stress. When someone experiences severe trauma, whether that's acute PTSD, chronic anxiety, or even severe physiological stressors like long COVID, the body triggers a massive release of a protein called nerve growth factor, or NGF.
Nerve growth factor. So the brain is literally growing something in response to the panic.
Yeah, exactly. It is building new infrastructure. This NGF causes your fight or flight sympathetic nerves to literally sprout extra branches. It physically rewires the architecture of your nervous system.
Wow, terrifying.
It is. Imagine your brain building a multi-lane highway dedicated entirely to panic. It locks the brain in a constant state of high norepinephrine, which is adrenaline, and it hyperactivates the amygdala, the brain's fear center.
So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt stuck in severe anxiety or PTSD, you aren't just holding on to the past. Your physical hardware has actually mutated to keep you in a perpetual state of alarm. Like you are fighting your own altered biology.
Exactly. And the clinical reality of that is profound, which brings us to the work of Dr. Eugene Lipoff. He's a pioneer of a procedure called the stellate ganglion block, or SGB.
And that's an injection, right?
Right. It's a targeted local anesthetic injection into a specific cluster of nerves in the neck that controls that fight or flight response. And what Dr. Lipoff explains is that this SGB injection rapidly drops that norepinephrine production and drastically reduces the nerve growth factor.
Okay.
And by doing so, it effectively prunes those extra nerve branches.
Pruning them. But how does that actually stop the trauma loop?
Well, think of it like severing a feedback loop that is constantly pouring gasoline on a fire. By temporarily blocking that nerve cluster, the brain stops sending the panic signal, the NGF recedes, and those extra fear nerves just die off. It resets the brain's hardware back to its pre-trauma state.
That is incredible.
Yeah, and the clinical trials show it works twice as well as a placebo for PTSD. The text actually shares this staggering case study from Dr. Lipoff regarding a military sniper who was intensely suicidal and just desperate for relief.
And what happened in the clinic?
Within 5 minutes of receiving this dual-level SGB procedure, the veteran's suicidal ideation completely vanished. He literally gave Dr. Lipov a high five in the clinic, and remarkably, he has remained symptom-free for 5 years.
5 minutes. 5 minutes to reverse years of trauma hardware. That is unbelievable. And there's a longevity angle to this too, right? Because living in that state of constant alarm has to be absolutely terrible for your cellular health.
Oh, it is catastrophic. Long-term, untreated PTSD doubles the risk of a heart attack. But Dr. Lipov notes that resolving this trauma with the SGB procedure reduces interleukin-6, which is a major inflammatory marker, and it reverses biological aging on the Grimmage epigenetic clock by roughly 2.5 years.
Now, for anyone listening who isn't familiar, the Grimmage clock isn't just counting the candles on your birthday cake. It is an epigenetic clock, meaning it looks at the chemical tags on your DNA to see how fast your cells are actually aging on a biological level. Turning that back 2.5 years just by calming the nervous system is wild.
It really proves that psychological stress is a biological aging accelerator. But the text makes a really brilliant pivot right here. It contrasts this trauma-induced involuntary rewiring with intentional rewiring.
Right, the good kind of stress.
Exactly. Because if we want our brains to stay young and resilient, we actually need to put them under a very different kind of stress to build what researchers call cognitive headroom.
Okay, let's unpack this because the source material brings up artificial intelligence here, and it feels incredibly relevant.
Oh, it really is.
It cites this MIT study showing that when people use ChatGPT to write an essay from scratch, they show reduced brain network activation, they write lower quality essays, and they completely fail to remember the material. So if we offload our deep thinking to AI, isn't that exactly like hiring someone else to lift weights for you at the gym and then being confused when you don't get any muscles?
What's fascinating here is how biologically accurate that analogy is. When you do the deep thinking yourself, when you really struggle through a complex problem, you trigger a physiological process called neurovascular coupling.
Neurovascular coupling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The brain realizes a specific neural network is being taxed, so it demands a massive surge of blood, oxygen, and nutrients to that exact area. By handing the task over to AI, you bypass the friction. You completely rob the brain of the demand signal required for neuroplasticity.
You literally deny your brain the cellular fuel it needs to grow.
Right. Dr. Tommy Wood calls this the 3S model for cognitive headroom: stimulus, supply, and support. You need the stimulus of hard mental effort to demand the supply of blood, which is then reinforced by the support of sleep and hormones.
And he works with athletes on this, right?
Yeah, Dr. Wood actually works with Formula One drivers to optimize this. By managing their physical supply and support using breath work, light, temperature to manually adjust their central nervous systems, he proves that the physical state of the body directly dictates their ability to perform complex cognitive tasks at 200 miles per hour.
That's intense.
It is. Continually demanding that effort builds maximum headroom, which is basically a neurological reserve that wards off cognitive decline and dementia as we age.
So we've established that the brain needs a command signal, the struggle of deep thought to demand resources. But a command center is totally useless if the factories producing the resources are broken. Like if your internal cellular engines are failing, no amount of mental focus is going to help you. You'll just be exhausted. So let's dive into the molecular fuel that is actually powering this entire system.
Right. So to do that, we have to move from the macro structure of the brain down to the micro level of cellular energy. And the text highlights a critical molecule called NAD plus glycol. It is the absolute cornerstone of cellular health. It fuels energy production in the mitochondria, specifically within the Krebs cycle, which is essentially your cell's engine, and it manages crucial DNA repair.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because if you follow longevity trends, NAD plus is just everywhere right now. I mean, I see people spending hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars on NAD plus IV drips or swallowing huge doses of precursor supplements like NR or NMN. But the text pushes back on this hard. Are we saying that flooding the body with raw NAD plus is actually a bad idea?
The data points to exactly that conclusion, especially as we get older. We look at the research of Dr. Nicola Conlon, a molecular biologist who specializes in cellular aging. And she explains that as we age, the specific enzyme responsible for recycling our existing NAD+, called NAAPT, starts to fail.
Okay, so the recycling drops.
Right. And at the exact same time, a different enzyme called CD38, which actively destroys NAD+ in response to inflammation, drastically increases.
Oh, wow. So your recycling plant shuts down and your incinerator kicks into overdrive.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. So Dr. Conlon points out that sending huge doses of raw NAD plus precursors into an aging body is basically like sending truckloads of expensive raw materials into a broken factory. The factory physically cannot process it.
It just piles up.
Exactly. The cell gets completely overwhelmed and converts the excess into metabolic waste. And even worse, clearing that waste actually depletes your body's methyl groups.
And methyl groups are vital, right? I mean, they are basically the tiny chemical switches that sit on your DNA and tell your genes whether to turn on or off. You do not want to be burning through those just to clear out unused supplements.
No, you absolutely need to preserve your methyl groups for healthy genetic expression. And this is why people taking high doses of standard precursors, or IV NAD, plus often feel terrible or get sick. The body attacks all that extracellular NAD plus as an invader, creating an inflammatory white blood cell response.
So we shouldn't be forcing raw materials into the system at all. We need to fix the factory machinery itself.
Right. The sustainable solution is targeting the body's natural salvage pathway. Dr. Conlon's research uses specific botanical compounds, things like rutin, alpha-lipoic acid, and apigenin, to fix the enzymes themselves.
That does work.
Well, she conducted a double-blind, placebo-controlled human trial using a comprehensive salvage pathway supplement stack. And in just 28 days, participants saw a massive increase in their own natural NAD plus phase, a measurable drop in systemic inflammation, and a reversal of their biological age by 1.26 years on the glycan age test.
1.2, 6 years younger in less than a month, just by helping the cell clean up its own recycling process instead of bombarding it with raw materials. That is incredible. And speaking of giving the cell what it actually needs to function, the text dives into the physical building blocks next. Trace minerals. If the cells are the engine, trace minerals are like the spark plugs.
That's exactly right. We look at the research of Caroline Allen here, and she highlights a massive modern crisis. Our filtered water and our depleted, over-farmed soils completely lack the essential minerals necessary to fuel these cellular processes. Research contrasting crops from the 1950s against crops grown in 1999 confirms just a devastating loss in nutrient density.
So if you are listening to this and you eat a perfectly clean, organic, whole food diet, this research says you still physically cannot get the trace minerals you need from the food alone anymore. But wait, I assume I can't just take a standard calcium or magnesium pill from the pharmacy to fix this.
Unfortunately, no. Caroline Allen points out that isolated synthetic supplements like bone-derived calcium or rock-based magnesium oxide only yield about a 10% absorption rate.
10%?
Yeah. Your body just doesn't recognize them. The remaining 90% is left to disrupt your gut microbiome. Instead, her research points to daily plant-based humic and fulvic acid complexes.
Humic and fulvic acid. How do those actually bypass that absorption problem?
They utilize this brilliant natural dual-action mechanism. Humic acid acts as Mother Nature's janitor, but it is far more complex than just sweeping up. It acts as a highly charged molecular magnet in the gut and bloodstream.
A magnet.
Yeah, it specifically binds to heavy metals, glyphosate from pesticides, and biowaste, locking them up so your body can safely excrete them.
Ah, so it clears the interference.
Right. Meanwhile, fulvic acid is microscopically small, but its real power is electrical. Mitochondria have a specific electrical charge. When the body is toxic, that charge gets thrown off and cell membranes harden, causing nutrients to literally bounce off the cell. Fulvic acid acts like a grounding wire. It changes the mitochondria's electrical polarity, unlocking the cell doors to deliver up to 22 trace minerals straight inside. Caroline Allen actually suffered from flatlined adrenals, severe brain fog, constant waking at night, and bleeding gums.
Eesh. Just a complete systemic electrical and physical breakdown.
A total collapse. But after a few months of taking plant-based liquid minerals, her dentist was shocked to see her gum disease entirely vanish, and her naturopath observed her adrenal function naturally surge back to healthy levels. These plant-based minerals provide the literal foundational structure for hormone production, gut health, and cellular electrical conductivity.
Okay, so let's track our progress here. We've optimized the brain's command signals, we've fixed the cellular factories with the NAD plus salvage pathway, and we've cleared the toxic waste and electrically charged the cells with humic and fulvic acid. The internal system is primed.
It is?
But to actually grow younger and prevent disease, the text insists you have to subject this pristine system to intense physical stress and meticulously track the results.
Right. Which brings us back to Dr. Tommy Wood's research, this time focusing on exercise. He strongly recommends incorporating 1 to 2 days of high-intensity interval training, or HIIT, and complex resistance training. A primary example is the 4x4 protocol. 4 minutes at 85 to 90% of your maximum heart rate, followed by 3 minutes of active recovery, and you repeat that 4 times.
No, wait, I have to push back here. This contradicts a massive trend in health right now. I mean, I constantly hear that steady-state zone 2 cardio, going for a brisk, pleasant walk or a light jog where you can still hold a conversation, is the absolute holy grail for longevity. Are you telling me a nice daily jog isn't enough to trigger this brain growth?
Well, brisk walking is fantastic for baseline cardiovascular health, but Dr. Wood notes that significant neuroplasticity, meaning actual structural growth in the brain, is strictly intensity dependent. When you push into high-intensity exercise and you are literally gasping for air, your muscles produce high amounts of lactate.
Which most people just think of as the stuff that makes your muscles burn.
Right. Exactly. But it is actually a powerful signaling molecule. That lactate crosses the blood-brain barrier and acts like a switch. It turns on BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Which is essentially miracle grow for the brain. It fertilizes new neural pathways.
It does. The text cites a landmark 6-month randomized trial comparing sedentary behavior, moderate jogging, and the 4x4 HIIT protocol. The HIIT group demonstrated vastly superior improvements in hippocampal structure and overall brain function.
Wow.
And remarkably, when researchers checked back 5 years later, those neurological upgrades were still maintained. Pushing through that intense, breathless friction is what physically forces the brain to build resilience.
But applying intense physical stress is only one half of managing the body, right? The text also dives into proactive tracking, using technology to see the unseen inside our organs so we can catch disease before it actually becomes a threat.
Right, and this is where the diagnostic insights of Dr. Daniel Sodikson, a chief medical scientist, and Dr. Mark Hyman come into play. They advocate for getting a proactive, full-body MRI in your 20s or 30s to establish a health baseline, and then repeating it every 1 to 2 years.
Which completely flips the traditional medical model.
Yeah.
I mean, usually medicine waits until you are in pain or showing obvious symptoms before a doctor will ever order a scan.
And by the time symptoms appear, the disease has often advanced significantly. But this raises an important question. How do we filter the signal from the noise? Dr. Sodikson explains the immense value of something called spatial context.
Spatial context.
Yeah. Every human body has weird anomalies, benign cysts, asymmetrical organs, things like that. If a doctor looks at a single, isolated MRI, they have to treat every anomaly as a potential threat.
Because they have no idea if that cyst has been there for 10 years or if it just grew last week.
Exactly. But when you take serial images over a lifetime, you give both the doctor and artificial intelligence a historical timeline to compare against. AI can detect microscopic cellular changes over time, tracking the velocity of a change rather than just looking at a static spot.
So how much does that historical context actually improve the AI's accuracy?
The data is staggering. When researchers fed AI models a patient's current single MRI to predict prostate cancer, the false positive rate was a terrible 64%.
64, that's huge.
Right, it caused massive unnecessary panic and biopsies. But when they gave the AI the patient's historical MRIs and blood context, the false positive rate plummeted to under 10%.
Wow, from 64% down to under 10% just by giving the AI a timeline to look at.
Yeah, and Dr. Sodikson reports catching numerous asymptomatic kidney, brain, and prostate cancers in patients who felt perfectly fine. It allowed them to undergo simple, localized therapy to eliminate the threat before it ever became invasive. Finding a stage 0 or stage 1 cancer essentially acts as a functional cure.
That is just incredible. So we've talked about applying intense physical stress to grow the brain and tracking our physical organs with MRIs to catch microscopic disease. But the text finishes with an invisible stressor, something that doesn't show up on any blood panel or MRI scan, yet directly accelerates our biological aging. Our unprocessed emotions.
And this is a profound shift in the text, treating emotional health not just as a psychological issue or a mindset problem, but as a deeply physiological process of the nervous system. We look at the teachings of meditation teacher and mystic Rosa Lewis, along with Sabina Selassie, and they discuss a concept called sacred sadness.
Sacred sadness. Okay, what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, when we feel intense grief, anxiety, or sadness, our modern instinct is usually to suppress it, to stay productive. Or we ruminate on the intellectual narrative. We spin a story in our heads, constantly thinking, I'll always be this way, or why did this person do this to me? Yeah. The text argues that to process the emotion physically, we must entirely drop the story and instead magnify the raw somatic sensation in the body. They even suggest using sad music or a film to safely let it rip, so to speak.
So what does this all mean? is repressing this emotional energy, basically like leaving heavy background apps running on your phone. You don't actively see them on your screen, but they're secretly draining the battery, heating up the processor, spiking your cortisol, and eventually crashing the whole operating system, like destroying your gut microbiome.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is physiologically what is happening. Rosa Lewis and Sabina Selassie teach that blocking emotions traps neuroenergetic tension in the body's tissues, causing chronic low-grade stress.
Wow.
Psychological shadow work actually shows that repressing our lover archetype, the part of the human psyche that governs deep, vulnerable feeling, forces the brain to overcompensate. It traps the body in a rigid, hyper-intellectual, high-stress state.
So we get trapped in our heads to avoid feeling the physical discomfort in our bodies.
Exactly. And Rosa Lewis shares her own intense breakthrough regarding this. A severe concussion forced her out of her hyper-rational intellectual paradigm because she literally couldn't think her way out of the pain. She ended up attending a shadow work retreat where she finally allowed herself to safely be destroyed by tears and repressed grief, just physically feeling the weight of it without attaching a narrative to it.
And what was the tangible result on her nervous system?
It profoundly downregulated her entire physiology. She experienced a complete reset of her baseline reality, moving from a blocked, high-stress state into one of deep somatic connection and profound equanimity. By deliberately dropping the story and simply feeling the physical sensations, the emotion peaks and naturally dissipates in just a few minutes, releasing a massive backlog of physical tension.
Which clears the chronic background stress that quietly destroys our cellular health and accelerates our biological aging. It's just an incredible full circle moment. To synthesize everything we've covered today for you listening, true longevity isn't found in a single magic pill or a biohacking trend. It is a deeply systemic approach.
It really is.
It goes from pruning the physical, mutated nerves of trauma with an SGB injection to forcing our brains to do the heavy lifting without AI so we can build cognitive headroom. It requires fixing our cellular salvage pathways so we don't flood a broken factory with raw NAD plus supplements, and utilizing humic and fulvic acid to electrically charge our cells and clear heavy metals.
Right.
It demands pushing through the friction of high-intensity intervals to bathe our brains in BDNF, establishing a proactive baseline with an MRI to give AI spatial context. And finally, it requires the immense bravery to drop the story and allow our bodies to physically process the raw, heavy weight of our emotions.
It truly highlights that optimal health isn't the absence of stress, it is the application of the right stressors and the efficient clearing of the waste left behind.
Which brings us back to where we started. If our brains physically shrink when we let AI do our deep thinking, and our cells age faster when we suppress our sadness to stay productive, we have to wonder, are we accidentally engineering a modern, ultra-convenient world that is perfectly designed to shorten our lifespans? And more importantly, what small inconvenience will you choose today to take your life back? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.